Well, this little letter to the Ephesians is interesting in today's churches, where so many people will begin to read the Bible, but when something doesn't particularly ring a bell, it's almost as though back in Arkansas we just back up and raise the plow and move on. We only hang up on things that are spiritually enriching and so on. So when one reads the letter to the Ephesians, one can go briskly through 3 chapters because very few things in there seem to ring a lot of bells. And we get on to chapter 4 and things begin to make some very crisp sense. But last night as we as we began to read through these opening chapters of Ephesians, we ran into some, in the Greek Bible, some very elaborate, lengthy sentences, all kinds of complex grammar and so on. We ran into some theological language that would not be common, I think, either on the streets of ancient Ephesus or in Denver today. We don't really go around doing redemption talk and reconciliation talk and so on a regular basis. So much of what we have, I expressed last night rather flippantly as flowery language, which is a word that some of the coon hunters in Arkansas used to use for big speech, elaborate speech. However, when we boiled that down last night, we found that in the first sentence, which is chapter 1, verses 3 through 14, there really is one major thought, and it occurs in verses 3 and 4. Basically, verse 4. God chose us before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless before Him. And that sentence governs everything in verses 3 through 14. Everything else in there elaborates in some way on that one sentence. He did say in verse 5 that we were foreordained to sonship, to be children of the Almighty. And so much of what we have in that sentence explains call to be holy and blameless as children before God. Paul, in sentence number 2, when he began to pray for these people, said that it was his prayer that somehow they might find, verse 18, the hope of his calling. They might understand what it was that God hoped when He called people to sonship. And not so much that he just hoped that that might happen, but he had tremendous power to make that happen. In verse 19, essentially, we had 5 words for power stacked up, which is a Greek way of emphasizing things, that God does want people to know what His calling was all about. But He certainly had the power to help bring that about. It was not just that this was thrown to the wind as an iffy thing. God's very involved with this. He had a plan. That plan involved Christ. It was a very solid plan. And He had the power to bring that about. Now, in chapter 2, where we were ending up last night, he talks with these people about their walk and stresses that the walk that they had formerly as pagan people had led them quite some distance away from what God had called. And now that these people who were far off, pagans, had been brought near, they were, according to chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, fellow participants. They were in a bigger to-do than just their little church, going to church on Sunday and so on. They were a part of a bigger movement, and very much a part of that. And so it was in the introduction in verse 10 of chapter 2 that he concluded last night in one brief little sentence, one crisp little sentence. We are God's creation. I think we think often about the creation when we look at something such as the Grand Canyon or awesome like that. And we think, beautiful sunsets, or as a flatlander driving in and seeing the white Rockies on the horizon and whatnot. To me, that's always an amazing thing. I mean, you get that view every day, and I get it once a year. But I always think, what grandeur we have, what power we have here. But in verse 10, we are God's creation, people. And that takes me to a book that I read years ago. My mother had trouble getting me to read in school. But once I started, she said we couldn't get the boy to stop. One of the first books that I read was a book by Thornton Wilder. You may remember him for his Bridge of San Luis Rey back in a fantastic short volume about the bridge over a chasm that crashed and so many people lost their lives at the Bridge of San Luis Rey, and his whole thing was about, so where is God in all of this? It was an excellent book. But the book that I read was The Eighth Day. And I think many people don't know that he even wrote that book. But I was more intrigued by the title. The book was about successive generations of families and how one generation affects the other and so on. It was a good novel. But the title, The Eighth Day, hit me. Because in going to Sunday school, we know that God created for 6 days and then He rested on the seventh. And the thought hit me, as I'm sure it did Wilder. But God didn't quit creating. There was an eighth day. And we live in the eighth day of God's creation. It didn't just end on the Saturday. He's still creating in lives like yours and mine, still bringing it about, and that's what verse 10 is all about. We are God's creation, having been created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God intended long ago that we should walk in them. Now, apparently, he's saying here that the Almighty created certain ways of looking at things, ways of making decisions, and intended that those be the way that people live or walk. Involves choices, as we'll come to in just a moment. Now, in chapter 2, verse 11, we mentioned last night toward the end that these people who make up the bulk of the church in Ephesus are people who didn't grow up in synagogues. They grew up in the pagan world. And he says in several phrases here, you were alienated from the Jews, you were strangers to the covenant of the promise, and so on. You were, in essence, very far off. But God broke that down and made peace, and this is where we ended up last night in verses 14 through 22 of chapter 2. God brought the Gentile people into a relationship in the church with the Jewish people, and it's no longer us and them. It's us. And that, to Paul, is a very important thing for these people to understand. When they go to church, they may not do things the Jewish way and so on, but they are very much an integral part of the church. Important for people to walk this calling, to understand that they're not interlopers. They're not just tag-alongs. Everyone who's trying to walk this walk is on the same platform with everyone else trying to walk this. And we'll watch that play out, but that's a very important part for him here. He puts verses 14 to 22 together to make that point. Now, in chapter 3, verse 1, we begin new this morning. He's going to make a prayer, but he breaks the sentence at the end of verse 1, and he does not come back to that prayer until verse 14. He has some more things he wants to say before he makes that prayer. Now, I asked the question last night, if you were going to try to get some people like these readers to listen to you make a very blunt statement to them that they really needed to get their act together, how would you go about that? Well, in the little letter to the Galatians, which many think, and I suspect is correct, was probably the first letter that Paul wrote, I think it's in verse 3, he says, "You stupid Galatians." Right after the, grace to you and peace from God our Father, you stupid people. Okay, now maybe he learned from writing Galatians that there might be another way to go about it. Okay, so he's spending 3 chapters here to sort of lay the foundation. Now, when we did Philippians last year, there was a similar use of this "I urge you" in chapter 4 there. There were 2 women, one named Euodia and one named Syntyche, who had had a fuss, and it had upset the whole church. And he was going to make a point, "I urge you, Euodia, and you, Syntyche, to get it together in the Lord. And their names are going to be called at the church house when this is read, a serious moment." So he spends 3 chapters laying the foundation to make that statement. Actually, he spent 2 chapters. And at the end of chapter 2, he starts to do chapter 4, but he writes another 3rd chapter in there. And I guess if you were going to call the 2 women's name, taking another shot at it to get it together here would be a good thing to do. And that's essentially what he does here. He's ready at 3:1 to make a prayer that will come about starting in 14. But he wants to say something else to these people to try to get them on board. So let's listen to 2 through 13. He said, "Surely you people have heard about how I was called to become a minister to the Gentiles." He says, "Other generations did not know that they could be a part of this Christian calling." He said, "God kind of laid it on my heart, as it were, to become an apostle to the Gentiles. So I've spent my career out there trying to help people understand verse 6, that they are fellow inheritors, fellow members of the body, fellow participants in." Now, remember that we had that yesterday in chapter 2, verses 19, 20, and 21. They are fellow citizens. They are joined together to work in one building. They are built together, verse 22 says. Now, he does that 3 times here. He puts the little word "together" on the front of his verbs to stress this unity, this oneness of these people. And he says, is it not in chapter 3, verse 7, that he became a servant according to the grace that was given to him by God, according to the working of his power. And to me, the least of all of those, this grace was given to become a minister to the Gentiles, to open up these unsearchable riches of Christ, to enlighten everyone concerning this great mystery that was hidden through the ages. And he says he wants this great mystery, that is, that God has people of all stripes. He wants this to be known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenlies. Verse 10. Now remember, we talked yesterday about these rulers and authorities being not village magistrates and local leaders. These are categories of spirit beings, used that way in Colossians and a few other places in the New Testament, and certainly here. But he's saying he wants this venture of God to have a called people, a chosen people, to be made known to these critters through the church, Is that not next in your Bible? He wants this message to be known to those critters who have to look at the church and see that it's doing it right. It's following the calling. Its participants are within the parameters. And as long as the critters, the powers, the authorities, the whatever that might be trying to do evil, are looking at the church, they're dumbfounded because they can't quite get a hold on these people. Now, these rulers and authorities are an interesting phenomenon. Do they exist? Is a question that I was always given, and I would have to say, in my world, no. I do not wake up on any given day afraid of the critters. My father had a belt. I heard that thing pop a time or two. I believed in that. There were things that I believed in, but I just never feared the critters in the dark. I never poked around under my bed before going to bed at night to see if there's anything under there. It's just not part of my world. But now, a whole bunch of my world has been spent in Central and South America among primitive people. And in their world, these critters are real. Now, if I'm going to be down there working with these people, should I try to convince them that my view is the right view? Or should I work with them in their view to help them make the kind of decisions that they need to make? I mean, what's the most important thing here? Whether they exist or not, I do not know. They may. They just don't function in the way I grew up and the way I lived. But do we have to change these people? When I was in the upper headwaters of the Amazon, I did a Bible translation workshop for the Wycliffe Bible translators down there on the Epistle to Titus for a couple of weeks. One afternoon, after we had finished our session, I went down to the edge of the Amazon. The guy down there had a pecky boat. The boat was carved out of a single tree. It was about that wide and about 30 or so feet long, and it looked shaky to me. I'd have felt better if it had an outrigger on it, but it didn't. But it had a little motor on the back and a long, I don't know what you'd call it, had a propeller on the end of it, and he would just steer the boat with that thing, and the little motor went pecky. So that's why they call it a pecky boat. So I paid this guy a little bit of money, and he took me down the Amazon for, 30 minutes or so, and I got out at this Indian village. Of course, they heard the pecky coming. Well, all the people come down to the edge of the Amazon, and they're going to see what's going to happen. And wife and I got out of the boat, and of course, the first thing I noticed was these women had nothing on above the waist. Now, I'd seen pictures of things like this in National Geographic, but it's another thing to be there in this Amazonian village. The people were real gracious. They took us around the village, showed us things. At one particular hut that we passed, there was a woman working on a sewing machine, one of those old treadle sewing machines, foot-powered sewing machines, was sewing something. And she had a bra on. And I made the comment to my wife, now there's at least one woman knows what she's trying to do. But anyway, we went on around the village and back on down to the main base, sundown. Was telling this little story to some of the people in there, and they said, well, now, in their view, the average woman wears nothing above the waist. That's just their view on things. Any woman who has anything on above the waist is a prostitute. So I said, well, now, what'd they think about my wife? And they said, well, they're wondering why you're with the... Okay. Now that's a very different worldview. But you know what missionaries have always tried to do in situations like that? We've tried to get them to do it our way as a major Christian commitment, rather than teach them to make the wise choices in terms of their worldview. So if one of those women from that Amazonian village was to come up here to this country, would we feel compelled to make her dress like us? And what would they make that woman feel like? The same thing it would make you feel like if you went to their village and had to dress like they do. You would just feel completely out of sorts, almost non-functional probably. So how is it with these demons and critters? Whether they are real or not, I think, is an irrelevant question. They were real to these people. And in that whole Mediterranean world, this is how people thought. It wasn't occasionally that people thought like this. This was the way people lived. This was the world they dealt with. So Paul is dealing with their world, and let's let him do that here to these Ephesian people. He says, we want the message of what the Christian people are doing in following their calling to be a clear-cut message to the principalities and powers that God's calling is working. We want that message to go out strong and loud and clear. The message, he says in verse 11, that God had in mind before He created everything. And he says, now what we want to do is make sure that we follow in that directive. If we do that, things are going to work well. Now in verse 14, he comes to his prayer. For this reason, I bow my knee to the Father, out of whom everything in heaven and on earth is named, that He would give to you according to the riches of His glory. And here's what he prays for: to be strengthened with power through His Spirit in the inner being. Now, of all of the things that he could have prayed for, why would he do that? Now, we've had one indication last night of how to get to a point of what a writer is saying. The I urge you and what follows that. Okay? There is another way to get to the point of what an ancient writer is saying, and that's to find the point of his prayer. Now, in ancient Egypt, they dug up years ago all kind of ancient fragments of writings, letters and business deeds and so on. That just the average writing of the day. And in so many of those, there would be a prayer. Now, it might not be a religious letter. A guy might be writing to his girlfriend. But when he says, "This I pray," her ears perk up, because that's where he's giving the tip-off that he's really saying something important. This I pray is a tip-off. So when he says here, "This I pray, that you might be strengthened with power in the inner man, that Christ might dwell in your hearts through faith." Now, that's not a mystical dwelling, I think, so much as it is an awareness dwelling, because twice before and again later, he will say, I want you to think about Christ. I pray for you wisdom and knowledge in Christ, he says, which means cognitive, something you're thinking about. For Christ to dwell in your hearts through faith involves thinking, not some mystical jumping on you. It's not as though something possesses you or shows up in you. In the letter to the Ephesians, Christ dwelling in you is His thinking being a part of your thinking. That's how He dwells in you. If you know how He did something, then you have a way of knowing how you can do that. You follow Him, not just theologically. You follow Him in that you think like He thought. You treat people like He did. For instance, there is the woman caught in adultery. How did He approach that? Well, you could approach a situation like that in all sorts of ways. what he did was, he said, what you need to do is go get your act together and stop doing this. Which meant he gave her a life. He didn't throw stones. He gave her a life. So when you run into somebody who doesn't have their act together, what do? You can throw stones, or you can follow Jesus and say, well, I know how he treated that woman. I'll try to go about it that way. And in so many ways, when we see Jesus in action, we have what Paul is talking about to these Ephesians. That's what it is to know Christ. Okay. That Christ might dwell in your hearts through faith, rooted and grounded in love, so that you may comprehend with all of the saints what is the height and depth, the length and the breadth. And then, he's off in flowery language for sure here. Okay, so he stops the sentence. Verse 19, he takes a new run at it. Well, what I mean is, so that you might know the surpassing greatness of the knowledge of the love of Christ. What you know about the love of Christ. So that you may be filled with all of the fullness. Now, so much of this language is said is flowery. and it is, but in a way, how do you talk about the greatness of God? It's almost as though you have to use bigger words and bigger concepts that are bigger than what we normally deal with. And here he does that. I want Christ to dwell in your hearts, and that's what it is, he says, for you to know the height and depth and length and breadth. Okay, so they go to church. They sing the songs. They do the religious rituals. They're good at that. Ephesians have been good at that. They can do that at any temple in town. They do that. But they're missing the boat. They're missing the calling. They're missing what it's about. Is Christianity about joining this religion and doing these songs and this sort of thing? Or is it about a way of life? And for religion in the ancient world, ethics was not so much a part of religion. You didn't go to the temple of Isis to learn how to live and make choices. You went there to have parties. You didn't go to the Taurobolium with the Mithra people to have the bloodbath and all of that to learn about how to make choices. You went there to have a spooky experience. Religion in the ancient world was not related that much to ethic. It's not to say that it was abandoning ethic. It's just that Christianity brought a new wrinkle to it. Christianity brought a calling to live in a certain way. And that was a unique sort of thing. For us, it seems like it's so much an integral part of the church that how you live is a lot to do with who you are as a believer. But for so many of these ancient people, that was not the case. So he's bringing something to them that in a way is foreign to their world. You go to the religion to get power over the critters. And he's saying, no, you go to Christianity to learn how to make choices. How to live, how to walk in the way. That's what the fullness, he says, is that you could be a part of if you just think about it. Now, he winds this up. Now, to him who is able to do far more than we ask or can even imagine, glory in the church, to him and Jesus Christ for all the generations. This is, use the word liturgical language. This is church house language. This is worship language. And so much of chapters 1 through 3 is worship language. And as to kind of wrap up this little session, his approach to try to get these people to listen to him is to take a part of their religious world that they both share, which is the worship side of it, and to throw in some ideas to that to get them to think about this other aspect that's not so much a part of their religious world. So in chapters 1 through 3, he's getting on the same page with them, but also bringing things to bear on that. I want you to have, every paragraph has some kind of a zinger in there that they need to think about what Christianity really is and what it involves and how much Christ is a part of that. Christ can be a part of religion. What has Christ done for you? He died for my sins. Okay, well, he did. But he also lived for you. And that life is a model, we say. It's a way to emulate, follow, and go like that. Okay? But for so many people, we settle for this theological answer. He died for my sins, which is almost like, well, I become a Christian, and I basically hang in there till Gabriel blows his horn. And what Paul is saying is, no, we have all of this nowness to deal with. And this walk that we have is an integral part of our faith. And in chapter 4, he's going to begin to talk about that. And I had thought, when I got up this morning, that this coughing business was over. But I did not cough until I got here. We're going to take about a 10-minute break right now, and I'll try to get this under better control. Okay, the prayer that has just preceded this was intended to be his final effort at trying to get them on the same page with him. And when you sort through all of that flowery language of the prayer, it appears that the core of it is, I pray that you will be strengthened with power in the inner being. And that's not a mystical thing, that's a very cognitive thing. He wants them to know more about Christ as example in following as sons. It's at this point that chapter 4:1 he intervenes in a completely different way. The flowery language is now gone. Everything is, it's right out front. You can't miss it. It is straightforward. My grandfather used to use the phrase a lot about calling a spade a spade. Okay, that's what it is. There's an old Greek statement to that effect. There were certain words one used that would indicate that he was a country hick. There are other words for that same thing that would indicate that you were a person of some class. So a lot of ancient education was learning which was the more appropriate word to use. And of course, he says a spade is a spade. That's what I call it. Okay. Well, this is what Paul does here. I urge you, therefore, as the servant of the Lord, to walk worthy of your calling, the calling with which you've been called. Now, that's the calling in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. And to do so, he says, with humility, with there's a word used here that sometimes is translated meekness. Is yours something like that? What do we have here? I can't.
Gentleness and lowliness.
Gentleness, okay. The older translations kind of use the word meekness a lot, which is a very different trait from today's world. Gentleness is much better. But the word actually is used by the Greeks to mean strength under control. Not just gentleness, but a strength that shows gentleness. It's the word used of a horse, big and powerful, a war horse that can ride right through an enemy in the middle of battle fearlessly. But it's so under control that the children can ride around the yard on its back. It's used in Greek of a guard dog that's powerful that could rip an intruder apart. But it's so under control that the children can wrestle on the floor with it. This word is strength under control. So the gentleness is the observable side of it, but what that word does not bring out is what's behind it is the power. What we don't want here is to come across with a Pee Wee Herman view of meekness. Now, I said that one time. I was at the University of Missouri at Rolla, and a young man in the audience had tears coming. Pee Wee Herman was his idol. I don't want to offend anyone here, but what we want to talk about with this character, with humility and gentleness, doesn't mean that we've given up on everything else that it takes to be a man or a woman in this world. Strength is a very important part of that. And both of these first two words have strength as a part of it. It's just that it shows itself under control. And that's where you get the humility. Not worthless, bottom rung of the ladder, everybody else counts but me. That's not humility. We go to counselors to be cured. That's not a Christian virtue. Nor is this namby-pamby weakness a Christian virtue. Both of these involve strength under control. Okay. And then to do so with what we have, long-suffering, patience. This is always in those Christian lists of virtues in some way. Putting up with one another is, I think, a way to put it. People have to put up with me, and I have to put up with some others. But we have to put up with one another. That's sort of what patience is, and long-suffering. Well, he says it here, doesn't he? Putting up with one another in love. He just makes it blunt. Making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit bound together in peace. One body, one Spirit. You've been called with one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father. The unity of the Christian movement. We're not just a bunch of independents floating around out here. And certainly we're not just a bunch of Greek Christians doing our thing over here while the main body over here does something else. We're together. He mentions in verses 7 through 9 verses that have drawn a lot more ink, I think, than they're worth. He wants to talk about Christ having ascended. And he quotes an Old Testament text, a little more of it than he needed. And the part that he didn't need, he made a comment on in verses 9 and 10, and then never comes back to it. But it was an aside comment, and I'm going to treat it that way as well. His point in verses 7, 8, 9, and on into 10 is that Christ ascended. Now, we're talking here about one who came from above, lived among us, ascended back. Okay, and this deal about, he quoted the part in here about he also descended. Well, what does that mean? And that leads commentaries off into, he went down to Hades and preached to the spirits in prison, and he did ta-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it has nothing to do with Ephesians. It really has nothing to do much anything. It's just that he quoted part of a verse, he made a comment on it, and then he gets off of it. So let's do that too. In verses 7 through 9, he just makes a point that Christ ascended. And that ascended one, that unique one who after his resurrection ascended to the Father, put certain things in place so that we would have a way for all of this to happen. He put in the deal of apostles. Some were prophets. Now, it doesn't mean that he calls certain individuals to do this. It means that he set up this kind of a structure. There were apostles out there helping. There were prophets that were helping. There were evangelists. There were shepherds. There were teachers. And all of this, he says, for building up the body of Christ. This thing is, it's a bigger thing than just going to a worship service. Yeah. There are a lot of people doing different things to make all of this work. And all of it, verse 13, toward building everything up into a oneness of the faith and, guess what? Knowledge of the Son of God. Now, all of this is to bring that about. So what is it to build up the oneness of the faith? He says it's knowledge of the Son of God. Everything that the apostles do, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, the teachers, it's all to help Christians understand the Christ, the knowledge of the Son. And if we have that, then we grow up, he says, to be a mature person. No longer a little childlike one. So what is it that makes a mature person? So far here he said it's thinking like Christ. No longer little children, verse 14, carried around by different waves or blown around by different winds, which is, again, poetic language. He specifies it here more so by being led around by all these cunning things that people come up with to teach this and that and the other. There are always people teaching this and that and the other. And in essence, he says, don't worry about it. What you want to know is the Christ. You want to learn about Jesus. That's going to be crucial. In the ancient world, as in ours, it is amazing how many things can crop up about religion. And you would think, my stars, I would never have imagined. Here's something else that someone's come up with. There are more religious idiosyncrasies than you can imagine. A few years ago, I was teaching at a graduate school. Needed to get away for 2 or 3 days, but because of some things the children were involved in, could not leave town. So I took a mental break. Went to my office, but I didn't do any work. I read the Epistle of Jude and the Memphis Commercial Appeal for 3 days. And I came up with a commentary on the Epistle of Jude based on the Memphis Commercial Appeal that predicted the end of the world. And all of these different things in the Epistle of Jude were linked up with things that were happening in the city of Memphis and how the end was near. It was hilarious. I showed it to my friend across the hall who had a PhD in religion from Princeton, and he laughed and laughed, and then he got real serious and he said, you know, the tragedy is this would sell. You know, I mean, it doesn't take much work to come up with some of this buffoonery that goes through the religious world. Oh, there are books out there right and left with all kinds of nonsense about this, and even about Christianity. I mean, and what he's saying here is cut through that stuff. Get back to the basic things about the knowledge of the Son of God so that you can grow up. No longer be a little child cast around by this and that and the other. He said, verse 15, what you want to do is grow up to the head who is Christ. How do you grow up to the head who is Christ? One way so far in Ephesians is to know his thinking. That's how you grow up. The more of that thinking you know, the more you grow. Which drives us again back into the Gospels, does it not? I've heard so many people say the Gospels are a mere prelude to Romans, which is where you learn how to become a Christian. And it's all Paul from that point. You need just enough Jesus to get you in, and then you get into Paul and find out what Christianity and redemption and salvation are all about. And I think what Paul would say is, no, you kind of get into Christ through Paul, and then you grow up in Jesus. You kind of switch that around. The Gospels are not a prelude to anything. They're what it's all about. After the epistles of Paul were written, the Gospels were written so that people would come to understand that it's not all about Paul. It's Christ. To grow up in every way to Him who is the head, out of whom the entire body is knit together. Everything kind of goes together to make a functioning body. If you have an adult body, if you have this thinking of Christ. So now, he jumps in verse 17 into a very straightforward calling a spade a spade. This I say, and I insist upon in the Lord, stop walking like the Gentiles walk in the stupidity of their thinking. Now, if there was ever any way to say, boy, we went from flowery language to calling a spade, verse 17 is it. I insist that you stop living like the Gentiles in the stupidity of their thinking. Their mindset is darkened. Their outlook on life, he says, is dark. It's alienated from the life of God. Now, there are two words for life in the Greek language. One of them is the word bios. We get our word biology from it, bios. And it refers to just living things. There is another word, zoe. We get our word zoology from it. And it was a word that in the ancient world referred also to the good life. To the good life. Well, now, the good life meant that we want to have a lot of things. We want to live in the right part of town, drive the right kind of carriage. You know, we want to take our vacations the right part of the Mediterranean. You know, that's to have the good life. That's this word. But Christians took over this word and they pumped into it all kinds of things of Christian mindset. They used this word to refer to whatever it is that Christians have that's beyond 98.6 and breathing. What is it to have life? Well, you have the bios, you have the 98.6 and breathing. You have life. But if you have this word, the zoe, you have whatever is beyond that Christians have that non-Christians do not. And he says here, if you follow this pagan mindset, you don't have the life that is beyond that Christians are supposed to have that non-Christians don't. You don't have that. On account of the ignorance that is in them, the hardness of their hearts. They've been given over to all kinds of depravity, verse 19, sensuality, and right at the end of 19, my text says that they want even more of it. I don't know how yours reads there, but they're greedy for even more of this. So they're on the underside, the dark side, and they're headed in that direction pell-mell. Verse 20, but you, and there's a word here that has a finger pointed at it in Greek. You don't use this word unless you're pointing a finger. But you did not learn this from Christ. Is that, again, a pretty close statement to what your Bible says? You did not learn that kind of garbage from Christ. Now, if indeed you have heard Him and been taught by Him, and don't forget that truth is in Him, he says, then what you'll do, verse 22, is you will put off the former way of living, the old man, as it were, the one that's steeped in all of these downside desires. You get rid of that. And you be renewed in the spirit of your minds. The mind is the thinking part. That's, in Greek, that's purely cognitive. You be renewed in the stuff you think. And put on the new man, which is created after God according to righteousness, holiness. So here's the old man, new man stuff. And I don't know how many books you'd be able to find at Barnes & Noble right now on how to put off the old and put on the new. Everybody has a take on how to be the new you and how to get rid, Yeah. Well, Paul he's pushing his book on that too here. How do you get rid of the old? Well, so many of us try to get rid of the old. And we're surprised when it doesn't work. That you wake up the next day, it's still there. How do you get rid of the old? Well, verse 23, I think, is what Paul's answer is. Something else roots it out. I was talking yesterday about this girl that was in my class some years ago whose life was in great disrepair. But she put off the old and put on a completely new. But it wasn't because she tried to put off the old and put on the new. She just started thinking different. And when she started running different thoughts through there, it changed. So I'm wondering if putting off the old man is not so much that we do as it's the kind of the byproduct of something we do. The old goes away when something new begins to take over. You run fresher stuff through. And the new man just shows up. So I think the books that are out there is how to put off the old and how to put on the new. And perhaps Paul would say in verse 23, don't worry about it. Change your thinking. It'll happen. Just change your thinking and let it work. That appears to me to at least be where Paul is coming from. And he did that not only here, he did it elsewhere. Will you turn with me back to the book of Romans? That's back to the west a little bit in your Bible. The book of Romans in chapter 12. And we're going to be at the first part of it. Romans chapter 12, and we're in verses 1 and 2. Now, we've run into a familiar friend here. The very first thing in verse 1 is, guess what? I urge you. Well, guess what? He's just written 11 chapters to get to this point. When you read the book of Romans, you generally read over as far as chapter 8 and then let the rest of it slide. 9, 10, and 11 we're not quite sure what to do with, and the rest of this is sort of downhill from there. No. If we follow what Paul is doing, chapters 1 through 11 are getting the reader ready to hear what he's going to say. I urge you, brothers, according to the mercies of God, present your bodies as living sacrifices pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service, something like that. When I was a kid in college, there was a little club called the Timothy Club for boys who wanted to preach. And I never joined it because I didn't ever intend to be a preacher. But I did go out on Sundays and lay untold amounts of ignorance on little small congregations around the state of Arkansas on occasion. I have apologized to some of those. Some of them no longer exist. But I was at one little, because I didn't belong to the little Timothy Club, I couldn't go to the neat places around close. I would get places up near the Missouri line. I'd be down in North Mississippi or somewhere. I would have to get up early and eat breakfast on the road just to get to some of these places. Well, I was at a little old place way up in North Arkansas. One of those rivers come down from Missouri that they used to float on. This guy had a cabin on that river. And of course, after the sermon on Sunday, you go out to eat with one of these fine people, and I went out to eat with this man. And he spent the better part of the afternoon trying to teach me that there wasn't a whole lot involved in Christianity, because the Bible says, after all he wants of us is a reasonable service. And it's right there in the Bible, isn't it? You know? Present your bodies a living sacrifice, pleasing to God, which is this is what you'd expect, your expected service. Okay. Not conformed to this generation, but transformed by the renewing of your thinking, your mind. Same word that we have over here. So that you may test what is the will of God, the perfect, mature, the perfect will of God. Same thing, is it not, here that we have over in Ephesians? He says, I want you to put off this old and be renewed in your thinking and put on the new man. So I take it then that those are not three different things. There's one thing. Think like Christ and let this other go away and let this new come about. But there's really one thing, and that's renewing your thinking. Now, having said that I want you to renew your thinking, then how does one do that? What does he mean, renew your thinking? Well, at this point, he steps in verse 25. Well, he says, the guy that's been lying needs to stop telling lies. He needs to start telling truth to his neighbor, because after all, we're in a relationship with one another. Well, when you have any kind of a relationship, is not trust and a basic? I was talking with some young people at Texas Christian on their campus not long ago about what's basic in life. And I took it back to trust, and one of them said, now, Dr. O, he said, there's got to be something more basic than trust. What is it that creates trust? Well, we began to talk about that, and you know what they centered on? Genuineness. His kids were saying, if it's like it appears to be, nothing under the table, it's all straight on right, then you can have trust. And I think, well, that sounds good to me. So if you are genuine and everything about you is as it appears to be, then we can trust one another when we say things. But if you're telling me a lie, that shoots trust in the foot. I wonder about your genuineness on just about everything, just as you would mine if I told you the lie. So he starts off with, just start telling the truth. And in verse 26, he quotes Psalm 4, be angry, but don't sin. Well, now we're back to that word we had a few moments ago about gentleness. See, there's nothing wrong with having a certain amount of anger. For the ancient Greeks, too much anger and you're hot-headed. Too little anger and you're a wimp. There are certain things in life that require anger. We see those on the evening news. We read about them in the paper. There are things that should make your blood boil. There is no way that should exist in a civilized society. Okay? You should have a temper. But, he says, be angry, but don't let it get out of control. Keep a lid on it. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Is that right? Yeah. If you've been stealing, quit stealing. I said yesterday that I work with a group of formerly incarcerated people and trying to help them get back into a meaningful place in life. For many years, I worked in Africa and thoroughly enjoyed working with people who didn't have anything, and if you gave them a little bit, they could use it to start a business, and they were off and running. And I enjoyed working with the people in Africa because of that one thing. They wanted to make a go of it, they just didn't have anything to start with. A $20 grant over there could start an entire business. Yeah? There's a village I had a phone call 2 weeks ago. The village of Chiwango. It's way out in the backside of Kenya. And when I first visited out there was a little path to that village. And it was about 10 kilometers off the road. That spooked me too. It was you heard it there, but you don't know what went on in here. It's about 10 kilometers off the road, way out in the backside of nowhere. The women of that village had to walk 8 kilometers down a hill to a river with these 5-gallon cans. Each woman had 2. They walked down there every day to get their water, and then they had to walk back up the hill to the village. It's river water. They know that you need to boil it, but when you've walked 16 kilometers, you don't waste anything. Well, that means they get sick because the water is not pure and so on. They had, the children out there had about a 3rd grade level of education. That's about all any could aspire to. There was no medical care. Absolutely nothing going on out there that would make you want to be there. But an old man got a shovel one day and started digging a trench. And the people asked him, kind of like they asked Noah, "What are you doing, old man?" And he said, "I'm starting the foundation for our hospital." And he dug a trench. He squared it out. The old man dug a trench. Well, the men of the village said, "Well, we don't have anything to do. Let's pour a foundation." So they built it. They built a little clinic. They had no doctor. They had no medicine. They had absolutely nothing. They had a clinic. They had no water. They had nothing. I heard this story. Went out to this little village and said, "Why don't we drill a deep water well right over there to have fresh water?" And the elders got together and decided that would be a good thing. That water well cost my donor $20,000. Boy, they brought out this great big old machine, drilled that water well, put a great big old diesel pump on it. They had pure water coming out of this thing. They spent about 6 training one of these local guys to be the attendant to that thing. People were coming from miles around to get fresh water. Guess what? The children no longer got sick, and they could go to school, and they got a teacher to come in that went all the way through high school for the little place. Okay? They got a nurse to come out. They got some medicine, and it didn't work because most of the medicine in Kenya is chalk dust. It's not medicine. It's sold as medicine, but it's just chalk dust. You don't get better. There's a place in Nairobi that guarantees medicine. It is what it's supposed to be. So I arranged for them to get their medicine from that place, and guess what? People started getting well. And people started coming from other places far around, because if you go to that hospital, you get well. They had water. They now had health. The women, you wouldn't believe what happened to this little village. I came back there 3 years later. There was a road to that village. There was electricity to that village. They not only had a nurse, now they had a doctor supplied by the Kenyan government. This little place was doing great. So they had a big deal, and they made me an elder of the village of Chaiwango. The men of the village carved an elephant-headed cane. They do that for every new elder in the tribe. Jerry, it's sitting right beside my library, in my hallway. This little village had this great party. But at that party, I asked the women of the village, what is the biggest difference? And they said, we no longer have to go to the river to get water. And we don't lose anyone to the crocodiles anymore. And I thought, man, that's great. So I asked the men, what's the greatest thing in your world? And they said, well, frankly, it's driving us nuts because these women don't have anything to do now. So, okay, there's a plot of ground over there. It doesn't have anything on it. Don't know who owns it. But what if we plant some stuff over there and start growing stuff, and the women of this village start growing things? You've got the water and whatnot. So the women thought that'd be a good idea. Now, you can plant corn over there, which everybody needs to live on. That's basic over there. But you can also plant, say, tomatoes. Tomatoes sell at market for 10 times the price of corn. And if you make the tomatoes into tomato paste, that sells for 4 times that. And there's a place in Nairobi that'll bring out little chili plants. They'll plant them free of charge. All the locals have to do is tend them and take the little chili peppers off. 40 times the price of corn. Now, if you've got a little 6-acre plot of ground that's got plenty of water and these women to work it and whatnot, can you imagine the wealth that comes into a little place like that? Built a new school. I mean, all kinds of things come because you help these people with a little grant. A little bit can do a lot. But in my country, I have found it very difficult to work with these people because they don't want to work. They want to live off the government. And that bothers me a great deal. So I found this group of people down in South Dallas where these guys come out of prison and they don't want to live off the government. They want to do it right. They want to work. They just don't know how. They don't know what. They don't know how to dress. They have a 3-month program that they go through on things like how to balance a checkbook, how to save $1 here and there. And how to you get up in the morning, you go to work. You don't call in sick. You go to work. And so on. Things they need to learn. But I've run into a bunch of people that really want to do something. They just don't quite know how to go about it. And I love that about these people. When Paul is working with a bunch of people here who they're in, but they're not really in. How does he get them on in? He says, well, if you've been stealing, stop stealing. Man, we had a 30-minute class the other day for these guys on if it's not yours, if it's a penny on the sidewalk, if it's not yours, you cannot afford to take it. They build that in as a mindset to these guys. You've spent how many years in prison? Some of it for taking stuff that wasn't yours. You don't take a single thing that's not yours. You have perfect honesty. So when you go to work for one of these places, you will never, ever be accused of taking something. Now, when you're trying to move into a new world, this kind of honesty is just totally important. And by the way, a week ago, one of the guys that graduated down there a year ago was honored by Embassy Suites as Employee of the Year. It's a privilege to work with guys like this, but you have to take it back to, if it's not yours, you don't pick it up. You know? Now, verse 29 is a pretty strong one. Don't let any untoward speech come out of your mouth. Well, this is one of the things, for instance, that we have to do with these guys. If they've been in prison for 15, 20 years, they have learned a way to talk, a way to express themselves. And if they're going to work at an embassy suites, they can't do that. They have to have a whole nother way of talk. One of the things that they asked me to do when I started working there was to be normal. So I wear this to South Dallas. They have to learn to run into me and my world. How to talk with a guy like... Most of these people have never met a white guy with a college education. They don't know how to talk with someone like that. And what he's saying here is you've got to have your language under control. Your whole way of expressing yourself under control. If you do this, everything will work out fine. Verse 30. Stop grieving the Spirit of God. All of this stuff that he has just mentioned, he says, you didn't learn that kind of thing from Christ. You are grieving the Spirit of God. Now, most of us, I think, when we go through any given day, don't worry about that. I've got to be honest with you. I live in this book, but I don't know that there are very many days where I get up and say, now today, frankly, I'm going to try not to grieve the Spirit of God. That's just not a thought that crosses my mind with any regularity. And when I do something dumb, then I'm very upfront to say, boy, that was a dumb thing to do or say. But I don't follow that up with, oh, I have just grieved the Spirit of God. So, I think all of us have a bit to learn here about what Paul is saying. If we're going to grow, we make better decisions, we get rid of some old stuff. But frankly, it boils down to there's another world up there where what we do is known. It's considered. So in verse 31, get rid of the resentment, the rage, the anger, the loud quarreling, blasphemy. And I'm sort of thinking about, well, if you grow up in Arkansas, you just cut out all her fun. You know? But he says, get rid of all of this stuff along with every kind of evil like this. And instead, he says, become, what do we have there? Kind to one another? Is that right? Kind? Kind. Kind to one another. Merciful. Forgiving one another just like God forgave us. We need to, he says, become imitators of God as children. Now, we've been saying that all the way through Ephesians, that we need to imitate the great Holy One, and we do that by learning about Christ. Walking in love just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. Verse 3, but fornication and uncleanness and greed shouldn't even be brought up when people are talking about you. It's just things that are befitting a holy life. We need to get rid of obscenities and foolish talk. I don't know, this next one, I guess, would be buffoonery. I don't know what your Bible has there. Has what?
Coarse joking.
Coarse joking. Coarse joking. Well, I don't know what a buffoon is. These things, he says, are just not pleasing. It's a mindset that is not godly. What we need to do is rather What? Give thanks? Mm-hmm. He says, I want you to know this, and you can count on it, he says, that all kinds of sexual impropriety and uncleanness and greed, which is idolatry, he says, these kind of people are not going to inherit the kingdom of Christ, God. So he's been very blunt with them at this point. I think almost to the point that if this were read, people would sort of take offense at it, because he's really pointing it out rather straightforward. In verse 6, he continues this. He said, the wrath of God comes upon the children of disobedience. You must not be fellow participants with them. And there's that word fellow again. You joined in with them. You should have joined in with this other. You're built into this building. Not that one. You were darkness, now you are light. So walk, and that's a full-blooded imperative, walk as children of light. And he says, the fruit of light is goodness, righteousness, and truth. Christian people need to be about the business of assessing things that are pleasing to the Lord. There's that Christ business again. How does he think? What kind of things would be pleasing to him? And you do not become fellow participants with their unclean works of darkness. You take a stand against that. You let it be known that you're not that way. That the hidden things that are done by them, underhanded, under the table, are shameful even to talk about. Now, verse 13. When things like that are exposed to the light, they're shown for what they are. It's just like it says in verse 14, and he quotes a little thing here, rise up, O sleeper, get up from the dead, and let the light of Christ shine on you. Well, that's not Old Testament. Phrases in there maybe come from the Old Testament. This would appear to be a part of a hymn that was sung in the early church. And it's almost like saying, okay, you sing this song in worship, why don't you live like it? I always hated preachers to do that. Take a song that we love to sing and point out how we weren't living like that. And it just ripped the heart out of that song for me. I couldn't sing it anymore because I knew darn well I was not living like that, you know. It was a good song, but I just, you know, I hate preachers that take good songs away from, you know. Well, come, let us live the music we sing. The hymnody, the words are all there. We just need to take them to heart. So, verse 15 says that. Take care how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Now, making the best use of time. How do you make the best use of time? Well, is it not a matter of making wise choices? I mean, making the best use of the time is making a wise choice. I have a 17-year-old grandson. Grandfather-grandson talks sometimes involve making wise choices. And sometimes the conversation goes the other way too. For all of us, old and young alike, the way we make the best use of time is to make wise choices. Because the days are evil. For this reason, don't become, foolish? But try to find out what is the will of the Lord. Now, we talked again last night about that. What is the will of the Lord? Well, it's whatever's within the perimeters. Try to find the stuff that's in the good side of the ledger. For example, he says, now verse 18, you have an and there or something like that. In Greek, that's a for example. don't be drunk with wine. That's not a wise choice. But be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, I always heard this was an argument against instrumental music. It wasn't, because it wasn't even an issue at the time. What he's talking about here is you get drunk, you sing what kind of songs? To the table down at Maury's? 99 bottles of beer on the wall? I don't know what people sing today, at the bars, but whatever you sing at the bar, he said that's over here on this side of the ledger. You ought to be singing things that are different. And he mentioned psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Now, psalms would be like Psalm 23, which is set to music. We sing Psalm 100 sometimes in church. It's been set to music for a long time. And in the ancient church, they sang psalms like that. Psalms back in those days had music attached to them. We no longer know what that music was, but it was sung to music. When I was in Scotland for many years, they would have the hymn numbers over here on one side posted up on the wall. And on the other side, they would have the tune number. So if it was hymn number 44, you'd be singing it to tune number 10. Everybody knew what tune number 10 was. So you'd sing these words to tune number 10. And well, it's kind of like that in the ancient church. You'd sing Psalm 23, but you'd have the tune over here. But now, what about the hymns? The hymns were Scripture put to music. Now, we do that too. We do that too. The steadfast love of the Lord ever. Okay. What is it? As a deer pants for the water, so my... Okay. So we're talking here about Lamentation 3. We're talking about Psalm 42. It's set to music. That's a hymn. Spiritual songs are whatever else we do in worship. All the way from the old Beethoven stuff that our choirs used to sing to things that... I'm going to use a phrase here. Please don't take it wrong. I come from an older period, but some of this music I call jiving for Jesus. And I'm sorry. I don't want to offend anyone. Okay. It's just that in my world, we have different views out there about what constitutes reverence, and I have a preference. That doesn't mean it's right. It's just that my preference is more reflective, but I have very good friends whose preference is more lively and animated. Okay. Okay. Well, these are spiritual songs. Okay. Whatever the deal, these are spiritual songs. But we sing those things as to the Lord. Yeah, Paul is actually saying that. You don't need to be going around the streets of Ephesus singing down to the tables at Maury's. That's not your world. You need to be going along in these other things. Well, now, quite frankly, how you think has a lot to do with the world you walk in. And if you're singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall, where is your head? But if you're going down singing some of this other stuff, then that heads you down a completely different way. For 3 summers, I worked as chief chaplain at a Boy Scout ranch in New Mexico called Philmont. I was the chief chaplain out at Philmont. And I always did the worship services with a little printout of songs. And some of the kids had never been to a worship service before, the first time they'd ever heard it, but they'd have these little songs. And lo and behold, during the week, as you were out in the backside of the mountains and whatnot, you'd hear these kids singing these little songs. Just running better stuff through there. Okay. I think what he's saying here is what we need to do is give thanks, verse 20, and be deferential to one another. I think the Bible says there in verse 21 in some of the English translations, be submissive to one another. Now, the word submissive in our language means knuckling under to somebody. This is a word that is used actually to refer to deferring to one another. It doesn't mean being in subjection. It means being in deference to one another. We defer. That's the way we get along. Well, okay, we'll do it your way this time. I'll get my way a little bit later. It's a deferential approach to relationships. And with that, he then kind of summarizes this whole deal. You don't steal from one another. You don't lie to one another. All of this garbage. You're not going out getting drunk together. What you're doing is you're deferring to one another. You have a workable relationship. There's no way to have a good, healthy relationship without some being in deference to one another. We just defer to one another. That's involves cordiality, involves respect. It means that somebody's not always overbearing and getting their way. It means that we're working this thing along. And that's verse 21. Now what he's going to say in verses 22 and following, after we take a short break, is going to be how we do that in our families, with our children, how we do this in our work. How do we go about having a deferential mindset to one another? Let's take again about another 10-minute break and we'll wrap this thing up. And by the way, you understand now that what I'm doing here this weekend is not so much elaborating on Ephesians, as trying to help you, when you read Ephesians, to read it a little bit more. More of it will begin to hang together and make sense. This is to help you read your Bible a little bit more carefully. Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break. Thank you once again for giving your Saturday morning and Friday night to this little book of Ephesians. It's so important to me that Christianity be based on a solid foundation, and I don't know anything more solid than just the biblical text. It seems that one doesn't really need the biblical text in some environments today to be a Christian, and I would have a different take on that. It seems to me that Christianity needs to be biblically based first of all. And that if Christians are going to be involved in something, the first thing they need to be involved in is, how do I think? Not how do I worship. I think worship's terribly important. But I think how I think is the most important beginning place for Christians. And as a professor in universities, Christian universities, for many years, I have been frustrated by the biblical ignorance that comes out of some of our churches. And I really miss the days of long ago when churches like this one would have a second minister who would be called the minister of education. We used to have master's degrees in being a minister of education, training the local teachers in classes and how to study the Bible and so on. And that passed away years ago. We don't do that kind of training anymore, and we now have ministers of worship. And please don't misunderstand, I'm grateful for that too. It's just that I miss the thoughtful side of Christianity more and more. Now, I've also been asked, to mention about tomorrow morning. It'll be at 9:30, I think, over at Crosstimbers. And as we did last year, I'm going to go elsewhere than Ephesians. Last year we did Philippians, and we wound up in Sunday morning in Matthew chapter 18, where the same point was made from a different point of view. We'll do that tomorrow morning as well. So this will be it for Ephesians, but the point that's being made here in Ephesians we'll pick up on in a very unsuspected place. I'll take you there. I will preface it by saying that it's a talk that I gave out in California many years ago, and I had 3 of my best friends in the audience that morning, all of whom agreed at lunch that it was one of the worst talks they'd ever heard from me. So, so if we're going to be submissive to one another, if we're going to be showing mutual deference to one another, how do we do that? And there are different ways to break down a church. And we could talk about, the little children, the high school kids, the young marrieds, and the senior citizens, or whatever they call it. What a life experienced. So I don't know what category I fit in anymore. We have a church I go to has 3 different groups like that, and I read all of the descriptions, and the one that I liked the best, I didn't fit with. So I don't know what we call ourselves anymore. But the way Paul breaks it down is he has wives and husbands. He has parents and children. And he has masters and slaves, because that was essentially the world that they lived in. So his way of breaking it down is this, and I think it's transferable to other ways we break down congregations today, but this is his approach. Now, when he talks about wives, and basically his point is to their own husbands. Now, the verb is left out. We supply it from verse 21. But in verse 22, there is no verb in Greek. Wives to their own husbands as to the Lord. Now, if he puts the verb in there, it stresses that verb, doesn't it? But if he leaves the verb out, what's stressed? Their own husbands. And that's the same thing he did. We were in Titus a while back. In Titus chapter 2, the older women are to be with their own husbands. In the ancient world, adultery was fairly common. This idea of being very rigorous in your marriage life, something Christians brought to the stage. In the ancient world, you would have the wife to whom you're married for property's sake. She is your official wife. Her job is primarily to take care of the household servants, to take care of the training of the children. She manages the affairs of the house. That is her job. Now, there's another woman involved for the sensual side of things. That's understood. But this woman is the official one. Her children get the property line and all of that sort of thing. But she's not necessarily the one with whom he's in love. There are treatises back there on how to choose a wife. Well, you choose one who's organized. She can get things done. She is effective. You choose her on that basis. In our world, how do you choose a wife? Well, I goodness knows. Shouldn't have asked that question. Here, wives to their own husbands. So the first thing that's said, if you're going to have a mutual relationship, is it's us two. And that's it. That's the Christian way of looking at it. And the man, says here, is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church. Now, it doesn't put a period there. The man is head of the wife. There are people who write books on how Christian marriages are supposed to be, and it does say the man is the head of the wife. Okay. This sentence says the man is the head of the wife in the same way that Christ is the head of the church. Not that he's the boss, but what is it that Christ does for the church? What is his relationship to the church? That's the relationship of the husband to the wife. So let's not put an unfortunate period in here and go talking around about boss man. Let's let the sentence be like it. We find out, first of all, how Christ is head of the church, and then we bring that back to the husband. And that's his role. So how is Christ the head of the... Well, the church is submissive to Christ. The wife should be submissive to the husband in all things. But, again, we find out how the church is submissive to Christ. That's the key thing. So many times I think people will just leave out all of this as Christ in the church and go about well, here's the husband and here's the wife, and he's submissive, he's the boss and she's submissive. Okay. The whole paragraph here is about how does Christ work with the church, and that governs the way we have relationships. If we understand that, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Okay, there's a tip-off. I don't know how that could be put any more basic. He gave everything for this church. And I don't know that we have texts that tell us he bossed it around. We have texts that say he called it, he called out the best in it, he gave himself for it. Verse 27 says that the result of what he did for the church resulted in a radiant church. Is that right? One that was beaming. One that just... I have a friend whose daughter was a student of mine some years ago, who had gone through some extremely tough times, and it showed in her face that her life had been ragged and rough. And I saw her not long ago, and it was a completely different person. It was almost like you wanted to take a picture of this and put it on a magazine. It was just beaming. Life had turned good for her. People had begun to treat her right. It just created a look that I don't think a woman could. You can't buy enough stuff down at the store to look like that. That has to come from in here. Well, Christ's relationship to the church brought out in the church that radiance. Something was working well in there that resulted in this radiant church. So if that's the way Christ approached the church, that's the husband's job. To create that radiance. A radiance that doesn't have, what does he say, no stains, no spots, no wrinkles. This whatever this thing is, it's picture perfect. So a man ought to love himself like his own body. He loves his wife like his own body. And people don't go around, he says, hating their bodies. But they feed it, they care for it, as Christ did the church. And we are his body. Now here he quotes Genesis 2:24, not as marriage, but for this reason a man leaves his father and mother and joins to his wife, and the two become one flesh. And there's again, for this reason. And that reason is a very healthy one, that they bring out the best in one another. This mystery is great, he says, but I'm speaking about Christ and the church. All throughout verses 22 and following, the key thing to understanding it, I think, is the relationship of Christ and the church. And so many times that's the tag along, and we talk about the relationship of the husband and the wife. But that's not the point. The point is Christ and the church. And then we talk about the husband and the wife. So, finally, verse 33, each of you love your wife. And it says here then that the wife does what to her husband? Well, if you have the old King James, she reverences her husband. But if you have an NIV or one of the newer translations, it probably says respect. There has to be some mutual respect here. Okay. So there's this mutuality. That's what that word in 21 means anyway. The deference we show to one another, that's a mutuality thing. And he brings that to bear in chapter 6 on the children and the parents. The children obey their parents in the Lord. That's as to the Lord, I think. Obey not your Christian parents, but you obey your parents in a lordship way. This, it says, is right. Honor your father and your mother is still, he says, a good text. In order that your days may be long upon the earth, he pulls that one in. And fathers, don't provoke your children, but you rear them, he says, I think the old text says, in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I think that's the old King James. The first one of those, the nurture part, that's what you do with the little kids. That would be the wife's job around the household, is to raise the little rugrats up into children that are about ready to learn. The second one here is when they go outside the family and have a teacher, an instructor. Training back in those days was not just like going to first grade or something. It was household instruction first, and then an outside teacher second. And you raise your children, he says, in that model. They're to be brought up in the household responsibly, and then you get responsible instruction for them on the outside. This deal here about not antagonizing your children, provoking your children, it's again a mutuality, I think, there. And the same thing with the slaves and the masters, beginning in verse 5. Obey as to the Lord, says with fear and trembling. That is, I think, with a good, healthy sense of respect. You don't want to be like so many slaves were in this time of ridiculing their masters. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this or not. So many people were illiterate in the Roman Empire and in Greece. And the slaves were sent to school to learn how to read and write and count, take care of the business and whatnot. And a lot of times the slaves were more educated than the masters. They looked down on the masters. There were all kind of jokes about these stupid masters and all of this sort of thing. And I think what he's saying here is, no, you have a healthy respect for the master. Sincerity, you do it as to the Lord. This whole business about slavery, I think, is an interesting question. We have to look at it in terms of their world, not ours. Whether slavery is right or wrong was not a question for them. That was the world they lived in. They had slaves. So the deal was, you be a good master and you be a good slave. Should Paul have done what modern people would have done and do away with slavery? Perhaps. That was the world he lived in. This is what we've inherited. We work along with this. I have done a good bit of writing on women in the church. And I've taken, frankly, a very open view on that. A very costly view. Because there's a lot of controversy about it. But I took a fairly middle-of-the-road view. I certainly don't feel at home with hardline fundamentalists in putting women in a position of almost total silence. Nor do I feel at home with the wild-eyed feminists. I feel more middle-of-the-road on this, and that's where my publishing was. And an article appeared not very long ago on how Osburn and Alexander Campbell missed it. I missed it by being middle of the road on women, and Campbell missed it by being middle of the road on slavery. So I don't know whether you're aware of that, but in the Restoration movement, Churches of Christ, Christian churches, disciples, Alexander Campbell was a formative figure back in those days. And it was a world of slavery. It was prior to the Civil War, prior to the whole issue. So instead of trying to do away with the institution, we work with the institution to have, as Paul said, good masters and responsible, respectable slaves. It was the middle of the road. Well, the current article says Campbell was totally wrong on that. He should have tried to do away with slavery. And Osburn totally wrong on it. He should have tried to do away with all forms of male dominance. Well, we can't judge a man 2,000 years ago based on the social structures that we have in our society. I'm very comfortable with a world without slavery. I don't like it. One of the biggest problems I had to deal with in Africa was child slavery. Taking these little kids off the street and whatnot and selling them into slavery. Oh boy, that's a huge problem. I am not a fan of slavery. But Paul lived 2,000 years ago, and this was the world that he lived in, and said, let's have responsible masters and responsible slaves. And if you have a problem with him on that, there will probably be an opportunity for you to discuss it with him. At some point when the issue is no longer moot. So with all of these, there is this matter of deference, is there not? In verse 9, masters, you do the same thing with them. What you want to do is no threats. We don't have any of that kind of garbage on, because you're dealing with a Lord up there that doesn't have any respect for masters or slaves, either one. They're all on the same level with him. So let's just say that in terms of how we put this together in families and churches and at work, we have this approach of being mutual deference. What does he say? Raised with one another, built together with one another. We're part of the same building. Through this book, 4 different times he has said, we are together in this thing. So part of Christianity is getting together and being along with it. How do we do that? He concludes it in verses 10 and following with a summary point about putting on the armor of God. You know the passage. It's one of the more often read and referred to passages of Paul. Put on the armor of God with which you'll be able to stand against all of the onslaughts of the devil. Because we do not work on flesh and blood, but we're against lordships and whatnots in the heavenlies. We have a spiritual battle going on around us. All the powers of darkness and so on, spiritual wickedness in the heavenlies and so on. So you need this armament of God so that you'll be able to stand. So you stand there. Verse 14. Now, this brings me back to when I was a semi-juvenile delinquent kid. They had vacation Bible school. And it was on Ephesians one summer. And the preacher said, now, Osburn, you don't have to come to vacation Bible school. He said, what I want you to do is go to the library instead. And you study up on Ephesians 6:14 and following, and you use your artistic skill. Bring it the last day, he said. Don't bring it early. Bring it the last day. And we'll have you present it to the children. So I went down and I read all kind of stuff about a Roman legionnaire, and I got this deal of a guy from the 10th Legion. Made a life-size cardboard back copy of this guy standing there with his helmet and his sword and his shield and all this kind of stuff, you know. Colored it all. It was magnificent. Put it up in front of the kids. Preacher said, now that's nice. He said, now it doesn't have anything to do with Ephesians. Carroll's missed the whole point. And he's right. I did. I missed the whole point. Because it's not about a soldier. It had to do with a soldier. If you were going to go out and fight, you know what you need to have. If you're going to go back in that elephant grass, you know what you need with you, right? You know what it takes. They spend a lot of time training you on what you need to take with you if you're going to go back in there and do that kind of stuff. All right? If a Roman was going to go out to fight against somebody, he would need his helmet and his sword and whatnot. But that's merely the imagery. That's beside the point. What are you going to take into battle if you have this kind of a spiritual warfare going on in your heart between good and evil? And you have choices to make, but you're pulled this way and you're pulled that way. What do you need with you? Well, if we were going to go fight in the backside of Vietnam, you would know what you needed out there. How much extra ammo, how much water you're going to have, and all of this kind of stuff. You know you're going to need that. He says, you people are fighting something and you need to have this. So he says, stand there. Around your waist, you don't need a waistband. He says, you need truth. You need truth. Whatever it is has got to be right. If you're going to fight a spiritual battle, you've got to know right. That's number one. And then, you put on the breastplate of what? You don't need a breastplate. You need righteousness. In here, you need truth and you need right. A sense of what is right. Being committed to what is right. And you need what? You need your feet. You need good footwear. Peace. Right? Peace. He said that what? Twice through here. Twice. Where he's joined us all together in peace. Three times he said peace in here. And then we have this shield, but that's faith. That's putting your weight down on that bridge we talked about. You believe what's right, but you really make choices that put your weight down on that. That's where you're going to go. And then you have, oh my goodness, the helmet of salvation. And remember now, salvation has a thenness and a nowness to it in Paul. So salvation is when Gabriel blows his horn, but salvation is also participating in all of this walk within the parameters, because those are saving moments instead of hellish ones. Telling the truth, not stealing, these are all saving moments. And then the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And now we're back to thinking once again. Prayer. You know, all of these things that are mentioned here are just what do you need if you're going to try to do something involving an internal struggle. And so many times we get involved in this Roman soldier business. We need the helmet of salvation. We need the sword of the Spirit. No, it's almost like forget the imagery. We need truth. We need righteousness. We need faith. We need peace. These are things that we must have if we're going to fight a spiritual battle successfully. Now, at the end of this, verse 19 and 20, Paul wraps it up by saying that he's been out there preaching this kind of thing, and he wants them to pray for him. That while he's in prison, he'll be able, every time he opens his mouth, to be able to say something important and vital, even though he's in prison. And he wants them not to worry about him. He's already said that once before. Don't worry about me being in prison. Just hope that I'll be able to do this solidly and in a right sort of way. So this kind of wraps up our little book of Ephesians. What is it to walk in the hope of his calling? I think he says it's to be involved in this spiritual struggle about whether we're going to walk inside the parameters or whether we're going to walk outside. That's basically what Ephesians is about. It's about the walk. And so many times we read through those first 3 chapters and breeze through them. It's worth your time to pause a little bit more when you read Ephesians the next time and see how he's kind of building that base for this discussion of choices. But Ephesians in a nutshell to me, is all about choices. Interesting thing about it, and I had a kind of little conversation at the last break about this. When I do Ephesians in Guatemala or the backside of Africa, we don't even have to worry about these principalities and powers. They know, they fight them every day. They take this thing straight out of here, straight to their world. We're the ones that live in a world where we don't deal with that. Okay? So whether we deal with it or not in our society, we all have the same spiritual battle. And the answer is still the same answer. Same problem, same answer. We just have a very technical world that doesn't deal with that. We do have to deal with parameters. And one of the biggest things the church needs to do today, I think, is look the world in the face and say, so you want to color outside the lines? That's okay in art class. But if you're going to try to put a life together, you need to find where the lines are and get inside those. And I think the church needs to be very strong in saying that. Outside the lines is not where we want to be. Okay? Thank you for letting me walk through Ephesians with you. You have been a very patient audience, and I thank you. That's it.